Okay, we are starting the last session, and I'm very pleased with introducing the final speaker of this symposium. Any good baseball team should have a great closer, and I cannot think of any better speaker to play that role. Honorable Ambassador Ira Shapiro, and I don't think that I need to introduce. I need to give a long introduction, although if I have to do it formally, it will be very long. He has been working for trade in USTR, working for U.S. Japan trade negotiation in the 1980s, not now. And also he was involved in the negotiation of NAFTA. And as a person who is in Texas now, I really appreciate his effort to conclude NAFTA, because the Texas really benefits from NAFTA. And that's the reason why it's easy to make a consensus for the benefit of NAFTA in Texas. So he was a long time trade negotiator of the United States, and he knows about how international trade is working, as well as how international economy is working. So please join me for welcoming Ambassador Ira Shapiro.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Hiroki-san. I'm very happy to be here. I'm always happy to be at the Wilson Center. Jane Harmon, president, was one of my first Washington friends when I came to the United States Senate to work a mere 43 or 44 years ago. Time flies when you're having fun. Jane was a senior person at that time, and her wisdom always impressed me. She must have been, I think, 3 years older than me, but it seemed like a lot at the time. It's not easy to be, and I want to thank the SMU Tower Center for giving me the opportunity to be with you today. It's not easy to be the concluding speaker in the afternoon, so I appreciate those of you who are still here. It's particularly difficult to be a speaker on trade after the very good panel we had before. Frankly, they've covered everything that was important to say. I learned a lot from listening to them, and Maria Solis is one of my favorite people in terms of being an authority. I always like to hear what she has to say about U.S. Mexico, U.S. Japan, and U.S. Japan through Mexico. So thank you, Dr. Solis. So because you're all so knowledgeable, and because of the good panel we had already, I will take a different perspective, or try to offer a different perspective on things, slightly different. I have worked for many years in international trade and U.S. Japan relations, but I've also worked quite a bit in American politics. I've written 2 books about the U.S. Senate. I try to see things in the trade realm from a substantive trade standpoint, but also from the standpoint of American politics. I think my perspective is a little unusual, but you know, you can take it, you can accept it or modify it or reject it, but it's certainly my perspective, and not the perspective of any of my clients, not the perspective of the fact that I'm a Democrat and a critic of President Trump in a lot of ways, but I think my overall perspective is at least worth sharing with you. I will return periodically to the fact that I believe the decision to abandon TPP was a terrible self-inflicted wound for the United States. I feel very strongly about that. I spent a lot of time speaking about TPP in 2015 and 2016, and writing some articles. I even worked pro bono because it was that important. I believe, and others have cited this, it's not a completely original thought, but what was frustrating to me was I thought it was the perfect, not perfect, but I thought it was the right trade agreement at the right moment in time with the right region. Everything about it made a great deal of sense. We had had this long deterioration of the WTO as a negotiating body. We had experimented at great length with bilateral trade agreements. Ambassador Lighthizer hasn't been the person that discovered bilateral trade agreements. Robert Zoellick talked about them too in his time as USTR. And we know the limits of bilateral trade agreements. We knew that Asia, the Asia Pacific, was the most dynamic region in the world, and we were in danger of being on the outside while economic integration took place. We were going to be on the outside, and TPP would have changed that. And finally, of course, since we're talking about US and Japan, TPP was the embodiment of a convergence of our interests and our approaches that was quite extraordinary when you think about it. So I will probably go back and forth to this, but I think it was a major self-inflicted wound. And the reason it's not always seen in those terms is because President Trump, the Trump presidency, the unusual Trump presidency, dominates the landscape. And it's hard for anything to compare to Brexit when it comes to an act of self-inflicted wound or folly. But this was a very, very serious problem, and we see it at work every day, the impact of it. So let me say that I think about the U.S.-Japan FTA, the negotiations, in that light as well. And I think about our China policy or lack of China policy in that light as well. So, and the last thing I want to say is, by introduction, Donald Trump made the decision to leave TPP. But I think the Democrats greased the skids for that. Senator Sanders was vehemently against TPP. Secretary Clinton shifted her position because of Senator Sanders' pressure and the pressure of the unions, the pressure of the quote-unquote Greens. It is actually literally the case that Mrs. Clinton might not have won the nomination if she'd been for TPP. But it was a tragic, in my view, tragic set of events which led to, I think President Trump could have fairly said, if I had a mandate for any one thing in trade, it was leaving TPP. The way I see TPP is that there was exactly one issue in 8 years that Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, and President Barack Obama agreed on, and it was TPP. That was the only issue they agreed on, nothing else. And so you have to worry about a political system that produces as bad a result as the one that we got when we left TPP. Now let's go back, since that was a rumination on TPP, but we're here to talk about U.S. Japan relations. So let's consider for a moment, we know the history, but think about it for a moment. The long history of U.S. Japan relations. I mean, in the post-war period, for a long time, the U.S. economic power was so strong that we could open our markets unilaterally to allow Japan and Europe to rebuild. And it was in our interest to do so. But by the 1970s, things had changed. And the U.S. was hit with the first blast of powerful international competition, mostly in steel, autos, then later semiconductors. And we remember that changed the U.S. view of its changed the economic situation dramatically. So we went through the 80s, and that was that period of Japan as number one, Ezra Vogel's book, Trading Places by Clyde Prestowitz, the notion that the Japanese model of industrial policy and government-led growth was something that the United States could not match up against. And by the 90s, the situation flipped. Japan had its difficulties. We were pushing to open their markets, but Japan had difficulties with its financial system and the real estate bubble. The United States benefited from its growing economy and from the dot-com revolution. And so the Japanese confidence of the 80s, or overconfidence in the 80s, probably gave way to a U.S. overconfidence in the 90s. And if you go then to the next decade, what you discover in the 2000s is that both of our countries were preoccupied with other things. We were preoccupied by 9/11 and the Iraq War and then the financial crisis. Japan was focused on its own issues as well, and then Fukushima in 2011. So a long period of time when we were distant, we were antagonistic in trade terms in the 80s and 90s. Then there was a neutral period in the 2000s when trade between U.S. and Japan wasn't very much necessarily, but it wasn't on people's minds. And then we come to this moment of convergence where Prime Minister Abe comes to office and uses his political capital to endorse TPP very early. You'll remember in 2013, nobody thought that Abe-san would endorse TPP until after the upper house election. And he surprised everyone, came out for it, got a mandate for it. And at the time, Barack Obama and Prime Minister Abe had come to a point, I think, of convergence. And it was a remarkable change in Japan's view of trade, and it was a potentially very valuable moment for the United States as well. So what happened then, basically, is that, as we know, the Democrats undercut the move toward TPP. President Donald Trump, as a candidate, was vehemently against it. And essentially, the United States left it. Now, one of the things I sometimes remind people of, and I mean, not this audience, you know this, but people who don't think about trade all the time. Donald Trump didn't discover the trade issue. We've been fighting about trade continuously since NAFTA. Those of us who were in the Clinton administration were we were hopeful that NAFTA would be the end of the problem. NAFTA debate was fierce, and NAFTA went through, was approved by Congress. Therefore, it was over. Obviously, that was not the case. The debate over NAFTA colored virtually everything that happened after that in trade. And through in the intervening years, the United States, in my opinion, established itself as quite an unreliable trading partner. You can ask Mexico, You can ask Chile, you can ask Korea, Panama, others. Donald Trump has made us an unreliable trading partner in his term, but we were an unreliable trading partner before that. So I have been hopeful, and perhaps naively hopeful, as always. I should tell you, as somebody who writes about American politics and harbored some hope that the Senate would make a recovery at some point. I start every day reading the Post and the Times with my wife over breakfast. I spin out an optimistic scenario. She says, I don't know what you're talking about. What's the basis of this optimism? And I'll admit, I was 6'3" a while ago, and now I'm down to 5'10". She's hammered me down. Events have hammered me down. But I was hopeful that at least the Trump challenge and President Trump's views of trade would spark a reconsideration by Americans and by members of Congress. And I think to some extent that's possibly the case. Now, when I said Trump did not discover the trade issue, that's true. But he is an enormously disruptive factor. And of course, we know that. But the reason is this. Although the U.S. has had this fierce internal debate over trade for 25 or 28 years, the president, Republican or Democrat, the president has always been on the pro-trade side. The president regarded it as his responsibility to be the leader of the liberal international order. And you'd fight back and forth about how much liberalization, but the presidents were always on one side. Trump is our first anti-trade president, so that changes everything, more than I thought it would change. So, how's he doing? Well, we'll see. I think anyone who had been elected president in 2016 would have been looking for a stronger policy to deal with the challenge of China. No question. Mrs. Clinton would have, anyone who had been elected. It doesn't tell you exactly what that policy is. And that's what we're seeing play out now as President Trump and Bob Lighthizer try to bring to conclusion this China trade agreement. And from my standpoint, going back to my quasi-obsession with TPP, the loss of TPP took away the positive component of our China policy, right? We were prepared to offer the Asia-Pacific region, and that's in Asia, and that's the countries that are not in Asia, but the Pacific. We were prepared to offer them a positive alternative to China's state capitalism. We had 11 nations signed up. Japan's joining that agreement made it the biggest agreement since the Uruguay round. It was a positive, high-standard, rules-based alternative. We had how many countries already lined up to join it after the 12, or wanted to join it, starting with Korea and others, Colombia, Costa Rica. I mean, there were, so it couldn't have been, that was our positive alternative. If you take the positive alternative out of your China policy, you've got nothing but hammering them. Now, you know, that may or may not work. We'll see. But I would have liked to have seen what a policy would have looked like with TPP on the one hand and strong policies on the threat to our technology that China does pose and other issues. So that destabilized our policy. And we'll see what Ambassador Lighthizer can come up with. On the USMCA, I share the view that Dr. Solis described. In my view, President Trump would have taken us out of NAFTA, no questions, absolutely no question. And I think the entire U.S. economy, virtually every sector, and through their representatives in Congress and even the Senate Republicans who are slavishly devoted to Trump, they pushed back quite hard. And I think Ambassador Lighthizer has done a very capable job of turning the issue, managing to say, well, we do need a North American free trade agreement, and we'll come up with a better one. We can argue about how much better it is. Some of it is, as you know, modernization of TPP that would have been done, modernization of NAFTA that would have been accomplished through TPP. But there are some useful and interesting provisions. Some of them would be difficult to administer. But at least there was a recognition that a U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, a North American agreement, was vitally necessary to our economy. However, as we enter a political season, I've been in a lot of presidential campaigns. I guarantee there are some consultants somewhere saying the best way to get those 70,000 votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania is to oppose the USMCA. I think it would be a terrible mistake. I think it would be terrible for the country, and I think it would be terrible for the Democrats if they're saddling with it. I'm older than most of you. Back in the day, in the 70s and the 80s, we used to say only Nixon could go to China because he was a hardline anti-communist, so he couldn't be attacked. Only Trump could renegotiate NAFTA. There is no room on the anti-trade side. I think that if the Democrats attempt to oppose or not move forward on this, I think they'll pay a high price for it. So we'll look to see what happens, and I think hopefully cooler heads will prevail. So if the President and Lighthizer are dealing with a very real problem of China and trying to figure it out, and if there's some hope that they've found an approach to the North American trade, where does that leave us with Japan? And to some extent, where does it leave us with Europe, the European Union? Well, frankly, in my view, and I'm sure the view of others, this U.S. Japan trade agreement is driven by solely the fact that we abandoned the need for it, is driven principally, I was going to say solely, that's probably not fair, principally by the fact that we abandoned the TPP. The number one item, as everyone has said, is the problems that our agriculture sector faces, pork and beef being the most visible, but others as well, because we didn't join the TPP. We're asking Japan to rescue us from what we did. That's not a very good place to be negotiating from, but that's essentially what this trade agreement's about. However, because it's about Japan, it has to also be about autos in some way. In my view, as someone who negotiated the 1995 Auto and Auto Parts Agreement, the decision to talk about, again, the balance between imports and exports in auto trade with Japan, the presumed desire of the domestic big three to sell cars in Japan. One is misguided and the other is just nonsense. Just nonsense. There is no real interest of those companies to sell cars in Japan. They have made the decision to go look at the rest of the world and say there are better markets for us. And that's a reasonable decision. But I don't think we should be motivated by the view that they actually want to do business in Japan. But of course, the more important question is whether we understand, we being the Trump administration and the Congress, whether they understand the realities of automotive trade. So President Trump at one point, early on in the administration, said, you know, the Japanese car makers should make cars here and not just build them here. Don't just build them in Japan. Somebody may have pointed out to him, that the Japanese automakers last year made 3.8 million cars and trucks here. 69% of the Japanese cars and trucks sold in the United States were made here. 24 plants, 44 R&D design facilities in 19 different states. In 1985, more than 90% of the cars that were sold in Japanese cars here were made in Japan, and now it's 30%. So that's a big change. And the effect that it's had, I would say, two effects it's had. Number one, we have a stronger automotive industry in the United States. We benefit from having the Japanese manufacturers here. We benefit, the U.S. Big Three makes better cars because of the competition here. We've welcomed the German manufacturers and the Korean manufacturers as well. And I'm sure that President Trump didn't know at one point that the United States, the auto industry based in the United States, exports more than 2 million cars and trucks to more than 100 countries. So I think we've done reasonably well in the terribly competitive, globalized auto market. And I hope that we will not be spending a lot of time bringing up the fiction of, fictions for inside U.S. trade. Fiction might not be the right word. Bringing up the very outdated notion that we should simply be comparing imports and exports, when in reality we've done quite well with the Japanese manufacturers who have, as they said they would, expanded their production in the United States. And they didn't start yesterday. They started in 1985 and accelerated it from then. So, finally, I want to conclude with one thought. And I want to go back to the beginning of my career dealing with Japan. In 1985, I became chief of staff to Senator Jay Rockefeller, who had just come up from West Virginia. He had been governor. West Virginia was hard hit by the 80s recession, and West Virginia has always been one of our poorest states. And they weren't coming out of the recession of the early 80s, even as other states were. In 1985, the first thing that I got to work with Senator Rockefeller on was the crisis that was posed by the possible bankruptcy and liquidation of Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel, the largest employer in the northern panhandle, where Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia come together. Trump country now. 10,000 jobs were at stake because the plant was facing bankruptcy and liquidation and had labor problems. And we worked on this constantly for more than a year. We did everything you could possibly think of to save this company. I went with Jay Rockefeller to Chase Manhattan Bank, which was the family bank. For us, we essentially begged for the loans to be rolled over, and the family bank said no. So we did everything we could. And what saved Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel, and saved all those jobs was a joint venture with Nissin Steel of Japan. They came in and they forged a joint venture, and the jobs were saved. And the people of West Virginia, who were anti-trade and not very at that time, and did not have a lot of experience with the Japanese or other foreign investors, they became believers in what foreign investment and Japanese investment could do for the company and for the state. And so that was a big lesson for me. Even during the hard trade negotiations that followed, I always remembered what Japanese companies could do. So when you look at the Gallup study a couple of years ago came out and said that unlike 1993, when most Americans regarded Japan as unfair traders, by 2016, 55% of Americans regarded them as fair traders, much different than the way they viewed China. And the reason for that was, number one, Japan was less of our trade deficit. But number two, they had experience with Japanese companies. They benefited from Japanese manufacturing. They thought of Japan differently because of the work of everyone from Toyota to Hitachi to So one of the things that I hope is that we don't in any way, and I don't think we will, but we don't in any way embroil the United States in a difficult or potentially acrimonious trade negotiation with no real basis for doing so. We had the right path forward before, and we squandered it. But that doesn't mean we should undermine the U.S. Japan relationship. So the last thing I was going to say, if I could find my watch, I'd see if it was the last thing I was going to say. There is, as you know, constant discussion of whether Prime Minister Abe whether his efforts to cultivate a strong relationship with President Trump have worked out. And he has sometimes been criticized for how far he has gone. I take a different view of it. I think Abe-san has been a very strong leader on trade. I think he has really tried to cultivate a good relationship with the president, but he has also led Japan to pursue their own interests. That's how the leadership of the TPP-11 came about, and that's also how the EU-Japan agreement got completed. I think I give Abe-san a lot of credit for the leadership he has exercised, and I hope that we will continue to have a strong relationship. So this really is the last thing. My larger point is that as I look around the world, virtually every country, major country, is expanding their trading relationships, looking for partners, negotiating preferential agreements. Mexico has been a great leader. I think it was 45 agreements. It may be more now. But others are doing the same thing. When we were finishing NAFTA in 1993, Canada was very ambivalent about NAFTA at the end. But Canada is a great leader in trade now. All countries are looking outward, trying to make trade agreements, recognizing the need for these relationships. Only my country sees it differently. America versus the world. So it has not had perhaps not had tremendous consequences yet. But this path that the United States is on, I think, could either lead to trade war or simply us being left out and left behind at some point as others go on pursuing their agreements. One theme that I've always had, and this was since the 1980s, we simply have to stop scapegoating other countries. And I'm talking about my country. I'm not talking about Japan. I'm talking about the United States position. We have to stop blaming other countries for what we haven't done. There was no foreign nation that prompted us to invade Iraq or ignore the subprime mortgages or ignore our infrastructure or ignore our opioid crisis. You can go down the list. These are all failures of our own country. And to cast everything as if it's a trade problem or somehow the blame of someone else is a serious mistake. I'm happy to be here today. It's a little more global than than just discussing the trade agreement, but you've already had great discussions of the trade agreement. So thank you very much, and I didn't go a whole hour, so we can have some questions.
We have time for Q&A and discussion. Anybody who wants to kick off? Yeah, Jim.
Well, you've had a lot of experience in American government, I'll say that, and you know a lot about Congress. What happened? Why did we lose this consensus on trade? And by the way, someone was citing earlier the latest data on public opinion data on trade, and the American people still remain positive about trade. So what is it with our government? What is it with our elected representatives that leads them down this path to be so mercantilist and nationalist?
Thanks for the question. Look, I think there's a lot of knowledgeable people in this room who have thought about it a lot, and you all sort of know the answer. And I guess, and I pick up pieces of it now and again. First of all, what I tried to say about NAFTA is this has been going on for a long time. I think NAFTA was the first real public debate about trade. And it was also the real first public debate that went beyond traditional trade. So it got into the conditions at the border and environmental rights, labor rights, etc. NAFTA represented a significant change. And after that, basically the debate continued along some of those lines. So I think that's one thing. We haven't had a consensus in a long time. I once said recently that we had a consensus in trade for about 5 minutes in 1988. The Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. We will negotiate trade agreements, and if we can't negotiate trade agreements, we'll use a strengthened 301. So we had a consensus, and it lasted about 5 minutes. NAFTA broke it. Number two, actually, we are still seeing in Robert Lighthizer, who's a very capable man, has been a great, strong leader in trade for a long time, we are still seeing a debate over the WTO. And when I say the WTO, I actually mean enforcement. Everyone's for enforcement, but there's a big difference between multilateral dispute settlement on the one hand and waking up one day and using Section 301 or Section 232 to be judge and jury. So that's a significant thing. The third thing, though, that I've thought about a lot, because I'm comfortable with where we are, that what we did on NAFTA was the right thing, and I'm comfortable that the strength of our economy in the 90s demonstrated that after NAFTA. There is no doubt that China's entry into the WTO had a huge and almost immediate effect on the American economy. So here's the numbers that I sometimes use, and they have the, as Kissinger once said, and they have the additional virtue of being true. The United States peaked at 19 million manufacturing jobs in 1979. In the next 22 years, we went from 19 million to 16 million. We went down 20% or so over 20 years, 22 years. That sounds like gradual change. China comes into the WTO, we lose the next 3 million jobs in 2 years. So a 20% loss over 20 years as opposed to a 19 or 20% loss in 2 years. That was a big, big impact. And so China, the impact of China's entry to the WTO, the tariff-free treatment, that was a big, big change. Last thing I'll say on this rather great question, because I love thinking about it. Alan Blinder, former Federal Reserve Vice Chairman, Princeton economist, great mind, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs recently called the free trade paradox. Why do economists all believe in free trade, but real people don't? And he said that economists tend to view the world in terms of overall economic growth and consumer interests. But most people have their consumers, but they're also possibly workers, and they have a different view of things. And yes, they like to go to Costco and get things that they couldn't otherwise afford, but they also are aware of the loss of jobs. So there's a lot of things going on. That's I'm a Senate guy, so I filibuster.
Thank you. Thanks for a really comprehensive, compelling presentation. To pick up on that point, I hope this is not so much a comment. I hope I can lead it to a question. So we've got all this political dispute over trade in both parties now. The Republicans who formerly were pro-trade are now in the Trump camp, and they're more anti-trade than they previously were, despite some staunch guys like Rob Portman and a few others. One of the failures, it seems to me, over this arc that you talked about today was that we never had a comprehensive approach to dealing with the dislocations from trade. So an enormous number of those are actually more as a result in the last 20 years. There's the China factor, but there's an enormous impact from automation and so forth, and that's probably only going to accelerate. So the question is, if we're going to get a consensus on trade, how do we get a consensus on the measures to deal with the dislocations, whether they're from trade or from automation, because they're going to be, in some ways, similar. So we just need a comprehensive approach. Given your Senate experience, there was always this really silly debate over trade adjustment assistance, and it always became a debate about how much, and they were incremental increases. The Democrats wanted it, of course, and the Republicans generally opposed it, but grudgingly went along. How do you get past that into something where we could actually have a more viable restructuring support network, social safety? I think Professor Takeuchi or somebody alluded to it earlier. I think we're really missing those kind of things.
No question. And of course, Jim, you've got a long perspective on this. But you know, we were talking about strengthening trade adjustment assistance as part of the NAFTA situation. We've been talking about it a long time and haven't really done it. I think that I would hope that the next president would go back at it and think about things a little differently, including various plans for wage insurance, for dealing with job loss and transition for people that is not just trade related, trying to put it in a broader cast. I also think that if we had the infrastructure program that everyone talks about, we could be putting a lot more people to work. But we've made a lot of policy. I mean, we haven't got the adjustment type program, and we haven't got a lot of the other policy things that we should have done. So it's going to be a part of, hopefully, the next administration. But, we'll see. The one thing I will say about the Republicans, and possibly I'm wrong, but I think the Republicans on trade have done, unlike certain areas where they've gone down the line with President Trump, there was quite a bit of pushback from Republicans, as you know, with respect to the USMCA particularly. I think there would be an enormous amount, and I should have said this in my 20 minutes remarks, which turned out to be 40. I think that they will, President Trump and Bob Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross need to tread very carefully on the 232 on autos. I think if they impose auto tariffs on Japan or on the European Union, I think they'll lose a lot of support on the Hill as well. I think the Hill Republicans have done some pushing back and had some effect on the way things have gone.
I have questions. May I? Yeah, sure. Coming after the last question, and that is, economists have good consensus that about 75 to 85% of the job losses in manufacturing sector especially are from automation, and then nothing related to trade. And here is another problem, that is, so the other at 15 to 25% overwhelmingly come from trade with, it's trade, but the trade with China. And then so trade with China, the impact of trade with China really makes trade with other countries kind of irrelevant. And but my question is that I'd like to focus on the automation part. So having said that, and then the other day I was listening to town hall meeting of Bernie Sanders, and he talks about, well, workers are suffering, and then certainly true. And then he starts blaming trade. And then he talks about we should do something. And then he starts talking about the importance of social welfare policy. But he didn't say any single word of either automation or technology. So why do those people especially Democrats who wants to emphasize the importance of social welfare policy have to blame trade before talking about social welfare policy?
Well, look, part of the politics of trade is, as we all know, the beneficiaries of trade are sort of dispersed. The people that are hit by it, are really hit by it. When I was in West Virginia as Jay Rockefeller's chief of staff, I visited plants that closed. When you go to one of those plants and you see what happens to the town around it, these are very, very serious things. And to some extent, people sort of understand automation and technology, and they almost even understand globalization in the sense they understand it, but it's not the government doing it to them. They see government, they see trade agreements as the government taking action that is harmful to them. But the other thing is that the Democrats, there's a split in the Democratic Party. The Senate Democrats have always been more open to trade than the House Democrats. The House Democrats have relied more on the labor unions for their support. So it's a harder politics. And I don't have to tell you, I mean, in Japan, Abe-san got great credit for being willing to advance TPP despite the fact that, you know, the farmers initially particularly were opposed to it. So every country deals with the politics of trade. It's just that ours have played out over a very long period of time.
Well, thank you for your great presentation. Mark Nakayama, Central Japan Railway. I'd like to ask you my big question about Japanese auto market. How do you see it historically with your experience? Because our auto market is said to be very unique or peculiar to European or American automakers, because it's so special that we have very specific standards and special consumer preferences that American or European makers cannot market in our country, except the luxury cars market, where our automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan are struggling our luxury market. Lexus is the only luxurious brand from our country marketing in Japan, and Nissan and Honda gave up marketing their Infiniti and Acura brands. And now we have a shrinking population with less growth. A lot of production in Japan and sold internally are smaller size. It's called K-car, Japan-specific standards. And how do you such American trade negotiators see our market? Could be a good market, still a good market for American automakers.
I would say I was once an expert in this subject, but that was a long time ago. I could tell you a lot about the Japanese the Shakun auto inspection programs and how they benefited Japanese cars as opposed to foreign cars. I'm afraid I have to leave the rest of it to other people. I would say that the U.S. companies, as I said, you know, they made efforts intermittently in the 1990s. They've reached the conclusion that they couldn't do very much in the Japanese market. And there's a world of potential consumers elsewhere. I think that it's fair to push Japan for transparent regulations and for perhaps mutual recognition of things. We've worked on things over the past. If Wendy Cutler was here, she'd give you 10 or 12 other things that I won't, because I can't recall them. But in general, I come back to the view that if the United States auto companies had moved as much production out of the United States as Japan has from Japan, our Congress would be pretty angry. I mean, I think Japan has worked very hard to accommodate U.S. concerns and to be part of this economy. And so we're doing the same with other economies, but not so well in Japan.
Please join me for thanking.
Thank you all.